Booming thuds began to echo through the corridors. The ventilation system was noisy, drowning out the footsteps of the laboratory staff. Mikhail was sitting in his cell, if you could even call it a cell. White walls, a built-in monitor that never turned off, and a barely visible surveillance camera in the corner. The only piece of furniture is a bed with a thin mattress. The walls glowed with artificial daylight, robbing him of any sense of time. Mikhail pressed himself against the wall, listening to the voices outside the door. They were distant, but familiar. It was Professor Gromov, the lead experimenter, and his assistant. Both of them, judging by their intonations, were talking about him. Subject 40. 7 is showing progress, Gromov said with barely concealed satisfaction. Synchronization with psi waves is growing, but unstable. If he breaks down like the previous ones. The woman stopped, her voice faltering.
There are no ifs! He's a key target!
Mikhail narrowed his eyes. A little more and he will be able to understand what they are talking about. In recent days, his hearing has become sharper, his thoughts clearer. Sometimes it seemed that he felt the presence of people even before they entered the room. It was as if something alien, strange, was stirring in his mind. He was once an ordinary man. The flashback hit him suddenly. He remembered himself in a subway car, surrounded by fellow passengers. Then there was a flash of light, distorted voices, as if broadcast from underwater. The contours of the creature, which looked like an iridescent mist, dissolved in front of his eyes, leaving a void. After that, there is only a dark laboratory and endless experiments. A noise sounded nearby, interrupting his thoughts. The door creaked open. 2 guards in gray uniforms stood on the threshold, their faces covered with black visors. Behind them is Professor Gromov, his narrow face twisted into a cold grin.
Mikhail, he began, narrowing his blue, almost dead eyes. Today we will take one more step.
Mikhail was taken out of the cell. The corridors of the laboratory looked endless, as if they were a living being in themselves, ready to devour anyone who dared to go against the system. The cold metal of the walls reflected his reflection, a haggard face, gray eyes, short-cropped hair. On his wrists were thin bracelets made of an unknown material that suppressed his abilities. They entered a large room filled with machines, screens, and medical chairs. One of them was waiting for him. "Sit down," Gromov said shortly. Mikhail sat down silently, feeling the bracelets increase the pressure. The machines around him came to life, making harsh, unpleasant noises. They connected electrodes to his temples. Gromov tapped on the screen, and a wave of other people's thoughts burst into Mikhail's head. "This is not your house. You have to find a way out. This is not your life." The voices grew louder. Mikhail gritted his teeth, feeling something inexplicable grow inside him. He clenched his fists. The screen next to it flashed, and then went out. Several appliances started sparking.
"Stabilize the flow!"
Gromov shouted. The assistants were rushing around the room, trying to turn off the equipment. Mikhail opened his eyes. It was as if a veil had been lifted from his mind, and for the first time he realized that he was able to influence the world around him. A new voice sounded in my head, cold and harsh. "You don't know the whole truth, but this is just the beginning. The machines have shut down." In the silence, Mikhail slowly looked up at Gromov. There was panic in his eyes, but he quickly pulled himself together. "Did you do it? What is it?" he asked, clenching his fists. Mikhail did not answer. For the first time in a long time, he felt confident. Now he knew that he wasn't just an object. He has the power. The only question left was whether it would be enough to break out. Mikhail was returned to his cell. However, now this place no longer seemed like a cage to him. For the first time in all this time, he felt like he could fight. Raising his hands, he looked at the bracelets, thin and featureless, but now he knew that they suppressed only part of his abilities. "Something inside me is stronger than this metal," he thought. His thoughts were interrupted by a strange sensation, as if someone else had appeared in the room. He turned around. The walls remained empty, and the monitor was blinking its usual blue light. But the voice, the one that had been in his head during the experiment, cut through the silence again.
Can you hear us, man?
Mikhail shuddered. The voice was both alien and calm. There was no anger or aggression in it, but he couldn't figure out where it was coming from.
Who are you?
He said aloud, realizing that cameras and microphones were recording every word.
We are the ones you will never see, but you will always feel. Your awakening has begun. You and me are connected now. Free yourself.
Connected? What does it mean? Mikhail spoke in a whisper, but his voice was clear, even in the silence. The voice did not answer. Instead, images appeared in Mikhail's mind. First the fog, then there is a creature resembling a vortex of light surrounded by darkness. This image flashed and immediately disappeared, leaving behind a strange feeling of longing and strength. A noise outside the door. Mikhail turned around. The lock clicked, and Alice entered the cell. She was accompanied by 2 guards. She looked to be in her mid-20s, but there was a weariness in her eyes that could only be caused by years of suffering. Her dark hair fell to her shoulders, and her slender arms were clasped behind her back with the same metal bracelet.
Hello, Mikhail,
she said, looking him straight in the eye. Before he could respond, one of the guards pushed her forward and roughly threw her into a chair. "The colonel ordered you to be interrogated," one of them said. "A conversation can be useful for the cause, just don't be silly." They left, locking the door behind them. "You can hear them, right?" Alice asked, softly but sharply. Mikhail was surprised. "Who are you talking about?" He clarified, but he read in her eyes that she knew more than she was saying. "About the voices. About those who come to us. They're real, Mikhail, and they want us to break out." He wanted to ask how she knew this, but again he felt this strange feeling, as if her words were not in his ears, but immediately in his head. "You. What is it?" he began, but she interrupted him.
I'm a telepath. They tried to suppress my abilities, but I found a way to use them. And you should do the same.
Her words hit him like a wave, awakening something deep inside. It wasn't just the truth. It was a reality that he couldn't ignore. Footsteps sounded outside.
They're coming to pick us up, Alice said. Are you ready?
Ready for what? Mikhail felt the bracelet squeeze his wrists even harder.
To start a fight. They're afraid of us. They know that if we join forces, they won't be able to keep us.
The door swung open. The guards appeared on the threshold again. The experiment is over. Mikhail was being led to another procedure, but now everything seemed different. Alice's voice sounded in my head. Don't resist yet. Wait for the moment. I'm with you. They returned to the hall, where Mikhail was placed in a chair, and Alice was taken behind the glass into the next room. Gromov stood at the monitor, calmly and methodically adjusting the equipment.
Today, we will test the limits of your abilities, he said with a cold grin. You will surprise us, Mikhail, or you'll die.
More electrodes, more searing waves of light, but this time something went wrong. Mikhail felt the energy boiling inside him. He didn't just hear the voices, he saw them. They were nearby. The screens began to blink, and there was a smell of burnt wire in the air. Gromov shouted something to the guards, but Mikhail could no longer hear him. He raised his head and met Alice's gaze through the glass. Now, she thought. He clenched his fists, and the bracelets on his wrists cracked, shattering into pieces. Alice stood behind the glass and silently watched Mikhail get rid of the bracelets. Her eyes, usually calm and indifferent, flashed with determination. However, the joy did not last long. 4 guards burst into the room with weapons resembling stun rifles.
Get down on the floor!
One of them roared, pointing the muzzle at Mikhail. But he was no longer the broken man they used to see. Something
has changed. His gaze was cold, as if he was looking at the guards, not as people, but as obstacles. Mikhail raised his hand, and the air in the room hummed. The guards started screaming, clutching their helmets as if something invisible had penetrated their heads and was tearing them apart from the inside. The first of them fell, followed by the second, writhing in convulsions.
That's enough!
Gromov's voice rang out like a gunshot. He pressed a button on the control panel. Metal structures protruded from the ceiling, emitting pulsating ultrasound. Mikhail shuddered. There was a ringing in his ears, and he collapsed to his knees, clutching his head with his hands. Alice felt the pain, too. Through the glass, she clenched her fists, but refrained from screaming. Her thoughts were rushing to Mikhail. "Don't give in. They're trying to break you." Gromov came closer, looking down at Mikhail. "I knew this was going to happen. You always think you can beat us, but you are just tools, nothing else." Mikhail raised his head. His face was distorted with pain, but there was a strange fire in his eyes. "You're afraid of me, Gromov," he croaked.
Afraid? You?
The scientist grinned.
You're just a toy. But I'll show you who's boss here.
He waved at the guards. Two of them, trembling, got up from the floor and put new bracelets on Mikhail. This time they bit into the skin, sending out weak bolts of electricity. Mikhail felt his strength leaving him. "Take him to the isolation ward," Gromov ordered. "And bring Alice. Her abilities are too dangerous to leave her conscious." Mikhail was thrown into a new cell. This time it was a tiny, completely dark room with no furniture. The air smelled of iron and something rotting. He ran his hand along the wall and felt deep scratches. Someone was trying to get out, and he obviously couldn't. He sat down on the floor trying to concentrate, but his thoughts were interrupted by fragments of other people's voices. "We have to stop them. This is the end. Help us!" Suddenly he felt a cold breath on his neck. Mikhail froze, but no one was there.
Do you think you've become strong?
A voice cut through the silence, thick and hoarse, as if coming from the very depths of the earth. Mikhail pressed himself against the wall. "Who are you?" "What is it?" he asked, but the voice continued, ignoring his words.
You don't understand. You didn't choose us. We chose you. You were empty, and we filled you up. You belong to us now.
A shadow appeared in the corner of the camera. It seemed too thick, too alive. Mikhail squinted, but his eyes did not have time to adjust to the absolute darkness. The shadow seemed to move, and then began to take shape. It was a figure that looked more like the outline of a man, but it was all made of darkness, out of nothing. "Are you one of them?" Mikhail couldn't believe he was talking to a shadow. "No, we are much older. We exist in every mind that wants power, and you're no exception." He felt a chill envelop his body. The shadow approached. Its face was only a few centimeters away from him.
You don't have to resist. You don't want to feel like you're useless again, do you? We can give you more. More than you can even imagine.
"I will not obey," he said softly, but his voice trembled. The shadow began to dissolve, leaving behind a feeling of emptiness. "Let's see."
Key.
At this time, Alice was taken to a separate laboratory. She was attached to a device that suppressed her telepathic abilities. Gromov stood in front of her, holding a thin metal syringe in his hands. "You have to understand, Alice, that resistance is useless. We will make you stronger, but only under our control. Michael is just the beginning. You will be our main weapon." Alice did not answer. She looked straight into his eyes. "Do you think you're controlling us?" "What is it?" she whispered. "But you have no idea what we're seeing."
"And what do you see?" Gromov asked, grinning. "Your death."
At that moment, the equipment began to spark. Alice felt the barriers in her mind loosen. She mentally turned to Mikhail. "They are making a mistake. Be ready. They are more afraid of us than we are of them." But at that moment, something went wrong. Gromov plunged a syringe into her arm, and she felt her body begin to tremble. Images filled her mind. Darkness, screams, wild eyes. She screamed, but it was soundless. Everything disappeared, leaving only a void. The silence in Mikhail's cell was deceptive. The darkness no longer frightened him. The shadow he was talking to left behind a strange feeling. She wasn't an enemy, but she wasn't an ally either. There was truth in her words. He couldn't stay in this place anymore. Suddenly, a high-pitched, ear-splitting siren sounded. Mikhail raised his head. The camera filled with red light. The emergency lights flashed. Somewhere in the distance, gunshots, screams, and the sound of footsteps were thundering. "Now!" He heard Alice's voice in his mind. Her message was barely perceptible, but it was her. Lively. Mikhail felt a wave of relief rise in his chest. He stood up, and his bracelets began to vibrate, sending faint jolts of pain, but it didn't matter now. He knew he could control it. Closing his eyes, he concentrated. He needed more power. Second. Another. There was a crackling sound in the cell. The bracelets gripping his arms shattered, shattering into pieces. Mikhail felt the energy filling every cell of his body. "It's now or never," he heard Alice's voice say again. The cell door opened with a soft hiss. The guard who was supposed to be on duty nearby was not there. Mikhail went out into the corridor and immediately noticed that the laboratory looked like a battlefield. The ventilation grills had been torn off, wires were sparking on the walls, and Gromov's voice was coming from the speakers. "All units go into full suppression mode. Subjects 40, 7, and 52 must be eliminated at all costs." Alice is also at large, Mikhail thought, clenching his fists. He moved forward, guided by her voice in his head. At the turn, he ran into the first squad of guards. 3 armed men instantly raised their weapons. "Stop!" one of them shouted. But Mikhail didn't even slow down. He raised his hand, and the space between him and the guards seemed to flare up with an invisible force. Rifles flew out of their hands, hitting them in the chest. They fell to the floor, gasping for breath. "Don't make me kill you," Mikhail said, looking down at them. One of the guards tried to stand up, but there was fear in his eyes. Mikhail felt this fear as clearly as if it were his own feeling. He turned away and walked on. At the other end of the lab, Alice stood in the middle of a large hall where medical experiments were usually conducted. There were broken chairs, broken screens, and blood on the floor. About a dozen guards were scattered in the corners, some unconscious, some dead. Alice was breathing heavily, and her hands were shaking. She could hear Mikhail's footsteps approaching. "You're on time," she said when he entered. "Did you do all this?" "What is it?" he asked, looking around. "They left me a choice. Either I break down or they break down. I chose the latter." Mikhail felt her tension transfer to him. Alice was strong, but at the limit. "They're going to activate the total suppression protocol," she said. "This means that everyone they can will be sent here soon." "Then we have to run." Alice shook her head. "You don't understand. They will never let us leave. Even if we get out, they'll find us." "What do you suggest?" he asked. She looked into his eyes. "We have to destroy this place, completely." Fighting was already going on in the corridors of the laboratory. Other experimental subjects, whom Alice had managed to free, began to resist. Mikhail caught a glimpse of some of them, a man burning walls with a touch, a girl who could turn invisible, and a child with a column of fire circling around him. But all this was not salvation, but chaos. Mikhail saw how the guards, who had received orders to kill, ruthlessly dealt with the test subjects, sparing no one. Alice and Mikhail reached the central laboratory, where the server center was located, controlling the entire system. Gromov was already waiting for them there. "You're not getting out of here alive anyway," he said, holding the remote in his hand. "I have one last trump card." "You talk too much," Alice replied, clenching her fists. Gromov pressed the button. Lights came on all over the room, and 3 tall humanoid figures emerged from hidden compartments. They were metallic, with dark glass faces. These were not people, but machines specially created to suppress those with psionic abilities. "Have you met your executioners?" Gromov grinned. Mikhail and Alice exchanged glances. "You forgot one thing," Mikhail said. "And what is it?" Gromov narrowed his eyes. "We're stronger than you thought." The silence lasted only a moment. The machines created for suppression moved forward with an eerie mechanical hum. Their black glass faces reflected the red glow of the emergency lights. Mikhail felt the air in the room fill with heaviness, as if these creatures were radiating an invisible wave of suppression. Alice hissed in pain, clutching her head. "They're blocking us," she whispered. "Their energy. It's like gravity inside the mind." Mikhail felt the same way. Every movement was difficult, and his thoughts were confused, as if in a viscous fog. But he knew he couldn't give up. "Hold on," he said, looking from Alice to Gromov, who was watching the scene with triumph. "These devices are designed specifically for you," Gromov said, shouting over the noise of the cars. "Each of them absorbs and processes your psionic energy. The more you resist, the stronger they become." Mikhail closed his eyes. "I had to find a way to fight." He concentrated, trying to overcome the suppression. The cars were approaching, their mechanical footsteps echoing in his head. "Mikhail!" Alice's voice sounded harsh. "If we fight against them individually, we will lose." Her words seemed to break through the thick fog. Mikhail realized that she was right. "Good. We're sinking," he replied, holding out his hand to her. She grabbed his arm. Their minds merged together. Mikhail felt his powers intertwine with her telepathy, forming something more. A flood of energy broke through the overwhelming wave, and the cars froze, their lights flashing. "What are you doing?" Gromov shouted, his voice trembling. "What you were most afraid of," Alice said, her voice sounding both hers and not hers. "We are becoming one." Cyborg started breaking down. The first collapsed, its metal limbs falling apart with a bang. The second one froze and then exploded, filling the room with thick smoke. Mikhail felt like the last car was trying to increase the suppression, but he and Alice were increasing the pressure. Gromov stepped back, his face contorted with horror. "No, you can't!" He grabbed the remote control, pressing the buttons, but nothing happened. The last car let out a loud creak, its body sparkled, and then it fell apart, leaving only a metal frame. Mikhail and Alice knelt down, breathing heavily. "We did it," she whispered, but there was no joy in her voice. "It's not over yet," Mikhail said, getting up. He looked at Gromov. "Where is the server?" Gromov tried to run away, but Mikhail stopped him by holding out his hand. The colonel was lifted into the air, and he froze like a puppet. "Mikhail, no," Alice said, seeing his gaze. "We're not like them." But he wasn't listening. Mikhail could feel the rage building inside him. Gromov was not just their jailer. He was a symbol of the entire system that destroyed people like them. "You've been experimenting on us," Mikhail said, clenching his fists. "You made us like this." "You don't understand anything," Gromov croaked. "You think you're fighting for freedom, but you're just kids playing with forces you can't control." Mikhail hesitated for a moment. His fingers loosened, and Gromov fell to the floor, breathing heavily. "Where is the server?" Mikhail asked again. The colonel, holding his side, slowly pointed to a door in the far corner of the room. "There. But by destroying it, you will destroy the whole place, and everyone else who's still here."
Mikhail and Alice exchanged glances.
"We don't have a choice," she said.
"If we leave this place, they will continue their experiments," Mikhail agreed.
They entered the server room. The room was cold, and the walls were filled with rows of flashing panels, cables, and server racks. Alice walked over to the central terminal. "If I overwhelm the system," she said, touching the screen, "the reactors will fail, but we'll only have 2 minutes to get out." Mikhail nodded. "Do it!" She started working, her fingers running over the keyboard. Mikhail stood guard, listening for every sound. The siren started wailing again. A voice came from the speakers. "Evacuation." A complete system failure. "Evacuation." "It's done!" Alice shouted, turning to him. They rushed to the exit. The laboratory was literally collapsing around them. Walls were cracking, ceiling slabs were collapsing. In the corridors, Mikhail saw other objects that were also trying to get out. When they reached the surface, the air was filled with explosions. They ran out of the elevator into the cold night. Somewhere in the distance below them, the laboratory exploded, sending a giant column of fire and smoke into the air. Mikhail and Alice fell to the ground, watching the flames devour all that was left of their prison.
Is this the end? What is it? She asked softly.
Mikhail stared at the fire, his face serious.
"This is just the beginning," he replied.
The cold night wind burned their skin, but for Mikhail and Alice, this feeling was a sweet reminder that they were on the surface. The forest and the endless starry night spread out before them. A huge column of fire and smoke was still shooting into the sky from underground, where the laboratory used to be. They sat on the rocks, trying to catch their breath. Mikhail was silent, staring at the bonfire of rubble. Alice, trembling with fatigue, clung to him. "We did it," she whispered. "We destroyed them." Mikhail nodded, but there was no joy or relief in his heart. He saw only the ashes and shadows of those who could not survive. "And now what? What is it?" she asked. "We can't stay here," he replied. "They're coming for us. Even if the lab is destroyed, the system that created it is alive." Alice sighed. "But what if it doesn't matter anymore?" Her voice was weak. "We're not the same people we were before we got there. There is something alien in us. Something that could be more dangerous for everyone around." Mikhail lowered his head. "We are the result of their experiments. But not only them. Those voices." He paused, remembering the shadow that had spoken to him in the cell. Her words, scorching, hoarse, sounded like a warning now. "You belong to us." Alice stood up, her eyes reflecting the light of a distant flame. "And if we chose them?" she said. "What if, despite everything they've done, we've become stronger? Or did they just give us the power to take it away?" Mikhail looked at her. "Then it doesn't matter anymore," she replied, her voice firm. "The main thing is that this is our life now." They moved into the forest. Their steps were cautious but confident. Alice walked ahead, checking the road. Mikhail followed her. At some point, he stopped. It seemed to him that someone else was watching them from the depths of the forest. A dark figure flashed in the distance between the trees, but as soon as he tried to examine it, it disappeared. "Is something wrong?" Alice asked, turning around. "No." He lied. It seemed so. However, his anxiety did not leave him. Later, at dawn, they found an abandoned hunting lodge. Its windows were boarded up, and the roof was leaking in places, but it was warm inside. Alice lit a small fire, and they sat by the fire. "We can stay here for a while," she said. Mikhail nodded, but he couldn't take his eyes off the flames. It reminded him of the power that was bubbling inside. He knew that their abilities wouldn't go away. On the contrary, they were getting stronger every day. "They'll find us," he said finally. Alice looked at him. And if so, what then?
He looked up at her.
Then we'll be ready.
A few weeks later.
Mikhail and Alice lived in the forest, training their abilities. Mikhail learned how to manipulate physical energy by creating an invisible barrier around himself. Alice improved her telepathy by learning how to enter other people's minds over vast distances. But the voices they heard were getting louder. Sometimes Mikhail would wake up at night feeling someone whispering in his ear, "You are our vessel. You belong to us."
One evening, when Alice went to get water, he saw her. Shadow. She stood in the corner of the room, taking on an increasingly human appearance. Mikhail stood up. His heart skipped a beat.
"Have you come again?"
he asked. The shadow did not respond, but its shape began to change. Now she looked like himself, like a reflection in a crooked mirror.
"Did you think it was over?" a voice asked. "What do you want?"
You know, we have given you strength, and you'll pay us back.
Alice returned at that moment. She saw Mikhail standing in the middle of the room and froze. "Michael? What is it?" she asked. He turned to her. His eyes turned completely black for a moment, but then returned to normal.
"It's all right," he replied.
But Alice knew that wasn't true.
Months have passed.
Mikhail and Alice went far into the depths of the forests, hiding from the world. But every day they felt their powers growing, and with them the influence of the voices. In one of his nightmares, Mikhail saw himself, no longer a man, but something else, alien, similar to those who gave them strength. He woke up in a cold sweat and realized that the fight was just beginning. He looked at Alice, who was sleeping next to him, and whispered, "We'll never be free again."